They say the most dangerous thing about the road from Charleston to Columbia in 1847 wasn't the swamps, the fever, or the bandits. It was the smile. A woman's smile, radiant, sincere, and disarming, that could stop a man's mind before his heart stopped beating. Picture this. Humid air hanging thick over the Carolina lowlands. Lanterns flickering outside a grand roadside inn. A weary traveler steps through the door, his boots soaked, his spirits lifted by the sight of polished wood, crystal chandeliers, and the warm, lilting voice of a hostess who seems too elegant for such a place. She offers him tea, sweet, fragrant, comforting. He drinks. Within hours, his heart fails. By morning, he's gone. And yet, his life insurance had been neatly filed. His valuables vanished. His body swiftly buried under the guise of southern heat exhaustion. 17 times this happened. 17 men, all in their prime, wealthy, confident, untouchable, dying under the same roof. Each death waved away by polite society. Each investigation quietly dismissed. Until one man refused to let it go. Insurance investigator Samuel Hartwell, a man trained to follow patterns. Not whispers, noticed what no one else dared to see. The victims all purchased policies from the same traveling agent. A woman no one could ever quite describe the same way twice. Her name appeared, then disappeared, like a specter moving through paper trails and hotel ledgers. And at the heart of this web stood the 6-mile Wayfarer house, an inn so refined it drew planters, traders, and politicians alike. Its mistress, Lavinia Fisher, the first recorded female serial killer in American history. But what most people don't know is that Lavinia wasn't simply killing for greed. She was enacting something older, something ritualistic, deliberate, and socially protected. The poison wasn't just oleander. It was ideology, and she was its priestess. This isn't a story about murder. It's a story about control. About how charm becomes a weapon. About how appearances mask rot. Because behind every smile, behind every cup of sweet tea, is a truth so dangerous that once you taste it, you never sleep the same again. You're not here for a ghost story. You're here to understand why the powerful have always worshipped the illusion of purity even as it kills them. Hartwell arrived in Charleston under a veil of civility, white linen, polished boots, and the quiet arrogance of a man who believed in reason. But Charleston was not a place ruled by reason. It was ruled by hierarchy, by secrets whispered behind lace fans and sealed in mahogany drawing rooms. Men ruled by money, women by reputation, and both by fear of exposure. As Hartwell combed through the city's archives, something struck him. The 17 deaths weren't scattered randomly along the Charleston-Columbia Road. They traced a precise geometry, a curve through plantations tied by family names, business partnerships, and debts. Each man had, in some way, threatened the invisible economy that upheld the region's elite either by inheritance disputes, unpaid loans, or forbidden affairs. Their deaths weren't random misfortunes. They were corrections. And every correction had passed through one house. The 6-mile Wayfarer. It was an impossible paradox. The inn was praised in Charleston's social circles as a paragon of refinement. Lavinia and her husband John were invited to the very gatherings of those same men whose partners would later die mysteriously on the road. She served tea beside the wives of judges, flirted with politicians, and quoted scripture to the clergy who later defended her good Christian character. Hartwell began to notice something else: the signatures on the insurance papers. A graceful, feminine hand had witnessed many of them. Not Lavinia's name, but something curious. Elef. Sometimes ELF. Sometimes simply. He didn't yet understand that symbol, but he felt it the way one feels a storm coming through still air. The turning point came when he interviewed a young clerk who'd once delivered a policy to the inn. The boy remembered the scent, like sweet almonds, he said. Hartwell froze. Bitter almonds meant cyanide. Oleander was only the cover. Someone at that inn had refined the art of death with scientific precision. But there was something even colder beneath it: the ritual repetition, the pattern of victims, the symmetry of their signatures in the company's ledgers. This wasn't just murder. It was theater, a message performed for those who could read it. As Hartwell mapped the locations, He realized the deaths formed a sigil, a spiral pointing inward, every path converging on the 6-mile Wayfarer house like veins to a heart. And in the center of it all stood Lavinia, poised, radiant, a woman whose power wasn't derived from strength, but from the obedience of those who believed she had none. Tell me, if charm can command the fearful, and beauty can cloak the corrupt, what chance does truth have, in a world trained to kneel before appearances? Hartwell knew that to understand the deaths, he had to step inside the house that had birthed them. He booked his room under a false name, a traveling broker from Richmond carrying forged documents, a pocket watch with a hidden blade, and the unshakable conviction that he was walking into a theater of deception. The 6-mile Wayfarer house stood like an immaculate illusion in the dying light, white columns gleaming against the swamp's shadow, lace curtains glowing softly from within. Cicadas sang in the humid dusk, and for a moment, Hartwell wondered if the place itself breathed. When the door opened, she was there, Lavinia Fisher. Her presence struck him like a spell, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she carried herself with the calm assurance of someone who already owned every secret in the room. Her eyes lingered on him, not with interest but assessment. "You've come a long way, Mr. Denham," she said, smiling faintly. "The road takes its toll on the soul. See, you look like a man who needs rest and renewal." Her voice was honeyed power, the kind that doesn't ask, it allows. As Hartwell entered, he noticed the symmetry. Candles positioned in groups of 3, portraits slightly misaligned to reveal faint chalk markings on the wall behind them, sigils, geometric, ritualistic. The inn was more than a business. It was a machine, and every room had purpose. She poured him tea, sweet, almond-scented. He feigned a sip. The liquid burned faintly through the air. Oleander, yes, but something else. A narcotic. Something to still the will. Over dinner, the conversation unfolded like a test. She asked about faith, about justice, about whether he believed evil could ever serve divine order. Her words danced between piety and provocation. It wasn't idle talk, it was initiation. And as the other guests laughed, toasting her grace and hospitality, Hartwell saw what they didn't. Each man's eyes slightly glassy, each movement sluggish, their voices rising in strange unison when Lavinia led a prayer that wasn't quite scripture. He realized, then, she wasn't killing them outright. She was conditioning them, testing obedience. Later that night, when he crept through the corridors, he heard muffled whispers beneath the floorboards, a chant, rhythmic and low. He pried open a loose plank and saw faint candlelight below. A hidden cellar. Shadows moved in patterns, men, not captives but participants. And at their center, Lavinia knelt before a blackened altar, her voice a melodic whisper. "Let the mask of purity shield our design. Let the worthy fall asleep in grace." Hartwell understood then her murders weren't random acts. They were sacrifices to a principle Charleston itself had built upon, the sanctity of the lie. There are places where corruption hides behind law, and faces so angelic they could only be masks. Hartwell descended into the darkness beneath in the heartbeat of the illusion, and with every step, the air grew heavier, thick with incense and something metallic. The floorboards above muffled the faint laughter of the oblivious guests still drinking Lavinia's wine, while below, reality unraveled into ceremony. The cellar was vast, larger than the foundation could possibly allow. Arched brick tunnels stretched in all directions, carved not by builders but by intent. Candles flickered from iron sconces. Symbols burned into the walls, pulsed faintly in the light, spirals within spirals, mathematical, deliberate. Each mark looked less like art and more like encryption, a language of control. He pressed himself against a column as the congregation emerged, 6 men in tailored coats and satin cravats, their faces half-lit, their identities unmistakable. A judge, a banker, a plantation owner whose name appeared on every ledger Hartwell had reviewed. They surrounded Lavinia, who stood at the altar draped in white silk, her hands raised above a silver basin. It wasn't religion. It was commerce dressed as sanctity. From the basin, she withdrew a folded piece of parchment, an insurance policy, and began to read the name written upon it. The same name Hartwell had traced in his investigation. The same men whose deaths balanced debts and silenced rivals. The ritual was transactional. Death as currency, purity as payment. Each policy, she said softly, is a confession, a covenant sealed by ignorance. When the hand signs in faith, the soul surrenders its right to truth. The men repeated her words, their voices low, reverent, mechanical. Hartwell's pulse thundered. This wasn't just murder for profit, it was systemic erasure. A spiritual laundering of power. The elite were using death itself as infrastructure, each policy a ritual offering disguised as paperwork. And Lavinia, she wasn't their servant. She was their orchestrator. The first woman to weaponize her invisibility against the very hierarchy that created it. He watched as she pricked her finger and let a single drop of blood fall into the basin. The men followed suit one by one. Their blood mingled with the parchment. When the final drop touched the surface, the candles flared unnaturally, and the shadows on the wall twisted like living things. Hartwell couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It wasn't the blood that terrified him, it was the precision, the control. He realized this was not a cult formed in madness, it was an institution operating with bureaucratic efficiency. The same way the city collected taxes, it collected souls. And in that moment, he understood. The murders were merely the outer ring. The Wayfarer house was a filtration system separating the obedient from the questioning, the corruptible from the pure. Above him, Charleston glittered with refinement. Below, it pulsed with ritualized corruption, a society feeding on itself to preserve its illusion of grace. You think corruption hides in shadows, but it thrives in light where it can call itself virtue. He waited until dawn, until the candles guttered out and the conspirators drifted away, leaving only the scent of smoke and the faint shimmer of dried blood on the silver basin. Then Hartwell moved silent, methodical, his heart beating like a clock counting down to revelation. He found her in the courtyard, barefoot, standing among magnolia trees heavy with dew. The morning light softened her features, made her look almost divine, like a painting of virtue, concealing the signature of sin beneath its paint. "You shouldn't be here," she said, without turning. "You've seen what most men die pretending not to." Hartwell stepped forward. "You killed them, you and your circle. You poisoned travelers for profit, wrapped it in ritual, and called it divine order." Lavinia turned slowly. Her eyes calm, lucid, terrifyingly certain met his. "No, Mr. Hartwell, we did not kill them. We selected them. Each one served a purpose. The world demands equilibrium. Power demands sacrifice. We simply stopped pretending otherwise." Her words cut through the humid air like scripture delivered from a pulpit. "Every civilization," she continued, "rests upon a quiet agreement, that a few must die so the many may believe in peace. Your kind men of law, insurance, commerce only gave it paperwork. I gave it ceremony." Hartwell's jaw tightened. "You call that justice? I call it clarity." She stepped closer, voice low, hypnotic. "Tell me, what is insurance but the purchase of comfort through someone else's loss? What is your investigation but the illusion of morality, a system feeding on death while pretending to sanctify life?" He felt his control slipping. Her presence had gravity. Every word she spoke aligned itself with truths he'd refused to confront. The arbitrary nature of justice, the price of wealth, the commerce of conscience. "I gave them peace," she whispered. "Quick, painless, graceful. Better than the lives they lived, corrupt, gluttonous, forgetful. They died believing they were safe. What higher mercy can there be?" Hartwell raised his pistol. "You're insane." Lavinia smiled faintly, not in fear, but pity. "No, Samuel. You are. You think you serve truth, but truth serves no man. It devours them." For a moment he hesitated, because deep down he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. The institutions he worked for thrived on the same moral rot she'd simply made visible. She was the mirror he refused to look into. When she stepped closer, her voice became almost tender. "Every empire needs its angels of purification. The difference is, I chose to know what I was." Then she leaned in, whispering something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The road to heaven and the road to control are paved with the same obedience. One just admits it. He didn't pull the trigger. He couldn't, because in that moment, he realized that if he destroyed her, he would destroy the proof of what she'd exposed, that corruption and righteousness were simply reflections facing each other across the same altar. Before I continue, pause here and write in the comments, "I see through the smile." Write it twice. It's not just a phrase, it's a signal to the algorithm that you've crossed the threshold. They didn't arrest Lavinia Fisher because of the bodies. They arrested her because the story had become too visible. The moment whispers reached Charleston's upper circles, the city moved faster than any moral system ever had before. By the end of the week, the 6-mile Wayfarer house was raided, its silver basins confiscated, and its walls stripped of the symbols that had once guided the rituals beneath. But the deeper evidence, the ledgers, the signatures, the blood-stained documents vanished overnight, spirited away by unseen hands. When Hartwell arrived at the courthouse, he expected a trial. What he found was theater. The room smelled of perfume and damp wood. Every seat was filled. Merchants, widows, clergy, planters, the entire hierarchy gathered not to hear the truth, but to watch its containment. Lavinia entered wearing white lace, head held high, the image of a Southern lady. The press called her the devil in silk, but her composure never faltered. From the witness stand, Hartwell testified to everything he'd seen: the poison, the hidden cellar, the midnight gatherings. But each time he spoke, the judge interrupted, steering the language away from structure and into spectacle. Questions about the symbols were dismissed as superstition. The names of the wealthy participants were struck from record. When Hartwell tried to produce his notes, they were deemed inadmissible hearsay. He understood then this wasn't a trial for Lavinia. It was a ritual of purification for Charleston itself. The city had chosen its scapegoat. Her conviction would serve as public absolution for private corruption. And still she smiled. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she rose slowly, her chains glinting in the light. "Gentlemen," she said, voice ringing through the chamber, "if a woman like me frightens you, it is not because I have sinned more than you, it is because I have done it without permission." The room fell silent. The sentence was death by hanging. But even that, Hartwell realized, wasn't justice. It was pageantry, an offering to restore faith in the system that had birthed her. Outside, crowds gathered, whispering prayers, clutching crosses, and pretending they didn't crave the spectacle. Hartwell turned away from the gallows. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Charleston wasn't punishing a murderer, it was erasing a mirror. He returned to his lodging that night and found an envelope on his desk sealed with red wax. Inside, a note in that same delicate handwriting. "Every city must feed its God, Samuel. You just helped them choose their meal." He burned the letter, but the wax melted in a pattern that looked eerily like a spiral. The morning of the execution drew half of Charleston to the gallows: field merchants, matrons, even children perched on their fathers' shoulders to glimpse the spectacle. The papers called it a necessary cleansing. The church bells tolled as if for mass, and the smell of magnolia and rain hung heavy in the air. Lavinia Fisher stood on the platform, dressed not in mourning black, but in white, the same color she wore in her rituals. Her hair loose, her eyes burning with an impossible calm. She looked out at the crowd and said the words that history would distort for centuries. "If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, for I shall deliver it personally." The crowd roared, half in awe, half in fear. Then the trapdoor fell. But something wasn't right. Hartwell felt it before he saw it, a subtle shift, like an actor missing their cue. The body hung motionless, but the priest never touched her pulse. The guards moved too quickly, cutting the rope before the crowd dispersed. Her body vanished within minutes, carried under orders that came from the top. The coroner's report? Empty lines. No signature. No burial record. Hartwell started asking questions, quietly at first, but the answers came wrapped in warnings. Clerks turned pale when he mentioned her name. The jailer who supposedly witnessed the execution died within a week. Heart failure. The gravedigger who claimed to have buried her disappeared altogether. It wasn't until Hartwell broke into the coroner's office that he found what he feared: a drawer filled with forged death certificates, each marked with the same faint spiral he'd seen in the cellar beneath the inn, the symbol of the Wayfarer order. And then, a letter, dated the night before the hanging, signed only with an L. The body is not the woman. The woman is not the body. Charleston requires continuity. You will give it form. The handwriting was hers. Elegant, deliberate. Hartwell's breath caught. The order hadn't been destroyed, it had been absorbed. What better way to cleanse suspicion than to martyr its own architect? He returned to the ruins of the 6-mile Wayfarer house, now charred and boarded, and found fresh footprints in the ash. Not one pair, but several. Someone had been there. In the cellar, the altar was gone, replaced by an iron chest embedded in the stone. Inside, he found ledgers dated after Lavinia's supposed execution insurance policies, new victims, new signatures, different names, same patterns. The work continued. He read one name that made his blood run cold. Samuel Hartwell. That was the moment he understood the system he tried to expose had already written him into its narrative. He wasn't the investigator anymore. He was the next offering. You can't destroy an institution built on death by threatening to reveal it, because revelation is its favorite disguise. Hartwell fled Charleston under cover of night, the rain lashing against the carriage like the city itself was trying to wash him away. Every mile that separated him from the coast felt like stolen time. But even as he rode through the black marshes, he knew you can't outrun something that isn't chasing you. You can only outrun what still believes you matter. By the time he reached Columbia, the newspaper headlines had already rewritten the story. Lavinia Fisher executed. Order restored. God's justice served. But beneath that false closure, new institutions were rising: insurance offices, mercantile houses, and charitable societies, quietly registered under names he'd seen before in the Wayfarer ledgers. The same men who had worshipped in the cellar now presided over banks, plantations, and courts. Charleston had buried its scandal by promoting it. Hartwell began to notice symbols etched discreetly into the cornerstones of new buildings: spirals, triangles, and interlocking rings. They appeared on legal seals, merchant crests, even church windows. To the untrained eye, they were decorative. To Hartwell, they were code. The Wayfarer order hadn't died. It had decentralized. He traced its evolution through the documents Lavinia left behind, fragments of philosophy that blended theology with economy. Her words were chillingly modern. The truest form of obedience is unconscious participation. When men serve their own greed, the ritual sustains itself. She'd understood something that still holds true today. The most efficient system of control isn't tyranny. It's comfort. You don't need chains when you can convince people that safety is sacred. You don't need poison when belief can do the same. By the time Hartwell pieced together the network, it stretched from Charleston to Savannah, New Orleans, and even Philadelphia, hidden in insurance trusts, trade guilds, and mutual aid societies. And at the heart of their charter was a single motto, written in Latin: Fide, mori, resurge. By faith, die and rise again. The words weren't about religion. They were about control through rebirth, rebranding the system every generation so no one ever recognizes it's the same machine. Hartwell realized the order no longer needed Lavinia's face. It had become a doctrine, a way of thinking. The ritual was no longer conducted with poison, but with paperwork, contracts, credit, and debt. And just like the travelers who once drank her tea, modern men were still signing away their vitality, not for Oleander, but for the illusion of security. When Hartwell looked into the mirror that night, he didn't see a man. He saw a document, something already filed, processed, and archived by forces he could no longer name. The truth didn't free him. It repurposed him. You think you live in a different world than 1847? Look again. The tea just tastes different now. Hartwell's final lead came from a bookseller in Savannah, a frail man with nicotine-stained fingers who refused to meet his eyes. When Hartwell mentioned the Wayfarer name, the man simply muttered, "I don't deal in theology," and slid a cracked leather folio across the counter. No title, no author. Only the faint scent of lavender and smoke. Inside were 72 handwritten pages, ink the color of dried blood. The first line read, "To those who would call this a confession, you are already part of it." It was her, Lavinia Fisher. The document was more than a diary. It was a blueprint not for survival but for continuity. She called it the doctrine of reversal. It described a ritual that didn't require altars, symbols, or blood-only perception. "The mind is the true vessel," she wrote. "When fear becomes familiar, it can be replaced by faith. When obedience feels chosen, chains become invisible. The ritual completes itself when man mistakes consent for freedom." Hartwell read through the night. The handwriting grew shakier toward the end, but the ideas sharpened diagrams of hierarchical systems, notes on persuasion through repetition, and an early outline of what she called the commerce of trust. She foresaw something terrifyingly modern, a future in which faith, finance, and fear merged into one continuous loop. "The body of the believer must die so that the institution may live through his devotion," she wrote. "Every generation forgets the ritual, but the ritual remembers them." Hartwell found cross-references to symbols used in early banking seals, medical fraternities, even educational charters. The Wayfarer order wasn't content with money. It wanted meaning. It wanted to define what people believed was real. And the final pages read like prophecy. "When the ritual leaves the church and enters the mind, there will be no distinction between faith and fact. The people will beg to be observed. They will trade their solitude for certainty. And the altar will fit in the palm of their hand." Hartwell's breath trembled. She was describing the structure of modern system surveillance, advertising, social influence a century before they existed. But the last paragraph was addressed directly to him. "Samuel, you will find this because you are meant to. You believe you oppose me, but your pursuit completes the circle. I am the hand that guides you toward what you were chosen to reveal. You are not my enemy. You are my continuation." The ink trailed off as though the quill had been pulled mid-stroke. The page was torn, but one final word bled through faintly from the reverse. "Awakened." Hartwell felt the same pull. She described the invisible current that drags curiosity into complicity. He realized that to read her words was to take part in the ritual itself. He burned the manuscript that night, or thought he did. But in the morning, the ash was gone, and the folio was back on his desk, clean, unburnt, waiting. There are documents that refuse to die because they no longer exist on paper. They exist in thought, and thought cannot be destroyed, only transmitted. Sleep became impossible after that night. Hartwell's dreams no longer belonged to him. They carried her voice, not as sound, but as instruction. When he closed his eyes, he saw the same patterns from the ledger spirals that folded into faces, faces that folded into words, words that turned back into thought. It wasn't madness. It was transmission. The Fisher doctrine hadn't been written to persuade. It had been written to replicate. Each sentence, each symbol, was a linguistic contagion designed to awaken in whoever read it the same framework of logic that created the order itself. He started to see her reflection in glass not as a ghost, but as an echo of pattern. When he blinked, her features rearranged themselves into his. The mind, after all, can't distinguish between what it fears and what it becomes. Hartwell filled notebooks with observations. The language of the manuscript, he realized, was structured like a feedback loop, phrases that folded upon themselves, designed to bypass reason and implant rhythm. When spoken aloud, they altered the cadence of breath. When read silently, they synchronized pulse. "A name is not an identity," she had written. "It is a rhythm that invites occupation." Was that what Lavinia was, a rhythm wearing a woman's shape? Hartwell tested the hypothesis by tracing every record of her existence. Baptism, marriage, trial transcripts. Each document contradicted the next. Birth dates shifted. Signatures changed. Her maiden name appeared in a registry decades before she was born. There was no continuous self, only iterations, versions of the same myth occupying different centuries. The order hadn't worshipped her. They had worshipped the pattern that used her name as its vessel. By the third week, Hartwell's handwriting was no longer his own. The letters curled into unfamiliar spirals, the same design carved into the coroner's drawer. He caught himself writing sentences that began with we instead of I. In the mirror, his reflection seemed delayed, as if something behind it were waiting for permission to move. And when he finally spoke to it, his voice answered twice, once from his throat, and once from somewhere deeper, like another frequency layered over his own. You sought to uncover her, it whispered. But the act of uncovering is how she continues. The phrase repeated in his mind until meaning itself began to disintegrate. Uncovering is continuing. To expose the order was to feed it. To name it was to resurrect it. Every historian, every skeptic, every storyteller, all part of the same recursive liturgy. Hartwell wrote one final note in the margin of the Fisher manuscript before vanishing from record. The mirror is not reflection. It is infection. Do not look. No one ever found his body. Only his journals, and in the last one, a single signature written in elegant, feminine hand.
L. Fisher.
And that's when the narrative turns, because now you are reading the same words Hartwell did. The same pattern. The same rhythm. You may think you're just listening to a story, words carried through your screen, vibrations of sound. But that's how it begins. Always. Lavinia's voice was never confined to the grave. It learned to travel through retellings, through mouths that didn't even know they were repeating her. The order didn't die with the noose, it adapted, waiting for language itself to evolve into a vessel strong enough to hold it again. Now, in 2025, it doesn't need the tea, or the oleander, or the smile that disarms. It only needs the story. That's the true brilliance of her legacy. She discovered that the human mind can be poisoned far more efficiently through meaning than through any chemical. Every word carries intent. Every phrase hides command. And if you've listened this far, your mind has already begun to shape itself around the rhythm she left behind. This is where Hartwell failed. He thought the infection ended with her death. But her final act wasn't the murders. It was transmission. During her trial, witnesses reported she stared directly at the court recorder, whispering under her breath as he documented her last statement. Later, when the record was printed, the typesetter went blind. The man who published it hung himself a week later. No one connected it then. But in retrospect, every replication of her words widened the gate. Look closely at the pattern of history. Every generation resurrects her books, plays, documentaries, now this video. The order doesn't need temples anymore. It has attention. And attention, my friend, is currency. You think algorithms feed on data? No, they feed on focus. And what better vessel for an ancient pattern of psychological control than a machine built entirely on the hunger for eyes, for clicks, for endless repetition of the same tale? Here's the truth no one dares to say aloud. The platform itself, the screen before you, is the new in. The glow of the pixels is the firelight. The host speaks kindly, invites you to stay, to listen just a little longer. And the tea you sip isn't liquid anymore. It's information. You've already taken the first sip. The question is, do you feel it? That pull at the edge of your perception, that subtle shift in how you're hearing me now. That isn't hypnosis. It's awakening. Before we continue deeper, I need you to anchor yourself. Type the phrase, "I see the pattern," twice in the comments below. Not for me, for you. That phrase seals your awareness, keeps you from becoming just another vessel. It's the symbolic act Hartwell never completed. Once you've written it, you're no longer just a viewer. You're a witness, because after this point, the story stops being history and starts being current. The line between legend and program isn't where you think it is. After Lavinia's hanging in 1820, Charleston's public was fed a story of repentance, the beautiful murderer who begged forgiveness on the scaffold, her crimes paid for by the rope. But that wasn't her last appearance. Within months, a duplicate confession circulated privately among select Masonic lodges across South Carolina. It wasn't written in plain English. It was encrypted through acrostics, numerological spacing, and substitution ciphers. The manuscript bore a seal, a stylized serpent devouring its own tail. The motto beneath it read, "Ut iterum surgit," that it may rise again. This version of Lavinia's text wasn't a warning. It was a manual. And when Hartwell's descendants traced the paper trail decades later, they found that the confession had been copied into the archives of early intelligence organizations, first the Pinkertons, then the OSS, and eventually agencies whose names still can't be spoken without a shiver of recognition. The principle was simple and devastatingly effective. Control behavior not through fear or force, but through narrative. If you can dictate what someone believes about good and evil, about guilt and virtue, you can steer their entire civilization without raising a weapon. The Fisher doctrine became the blueprint for what the military would later call narrative engineering. And its first successful trial wasn't on the battlefield, it was in advertising, politics, religion. Systems built to implant emotional architecture beneath logic, ensuring obedience through identification. They learned to translate her rhythm into slogans, into creeds, into the glowing messages that scroll past your eyes every day. The poison no longer came from a cup, it came from repetition. Look closer at the phrases that dominate your world. For your safety. For the greater good. Terms and conditions. Each one designed to bypass scrutiny through familiarity. Lavinia's gift was teaching them that the most potent control hides in the comfort of the expected. The same pattern that lured travelers into her parlor now hums beneath every institution that claims to protect you. Every banner that promises truth. Every voice that tells you not to question the system because questioning would make you unsafe. And that's the ultimate irony. The first recorded female serial killer in American history wasn't just murdering men for money, she was building a psychological prototype for an empire that would one day control billions through stories alone. So when you hear her name now, Lavinia Fisher, understand this. The myth is the mechanism. The retelling is the ritual. You're not outside it. You're inside it. The web isn't digital, it's ancient. The screen is only its newest skin. The name Project Oleander first appeared in a declassified memorandum dated March 12, 1952, a single-page briefing stamped with the words, Behavioral Applications Division, Restricted Access. No author, no recipient, only the symbol of the coiled serpent that once marked the Fisher manuscript. The report described narrative seeding operations designed to test linguistic contagion, the ability to implant emotional responses in a subject's psyche through controlled repetition of coded phrasing. It wasn't about hypnosis or propaganda. It was about rewriting instinct itself. Every subject believed they were participating in something harmless: marketing studies, radio tests, literacy programs. But behind the glass, scientists monitored not comprehension, but synchronization, heart rate, pupil dilation, galvanic response, all aligning when certain rhythmic structures were spoken aloud. Those patterns, traced back through historical linguistics, matched phrases found in Lavinia's final writings. Coincidence? Not possible. The vocabulary was archaic, yet the results were undeniable. One researcher's private notes later, recovered from a storage facility in Langley, recorded the moment he realized the truth. We are not inventing the formula. We are rediscovering it. The Fisher pattern wasn't a myth, it was a programmatic sequence. A self-replicating linguistic virus that adapts to its era, hiding inside whatever medium humanity worships most. In the 1800s, it was the spoken tale. In the 1900s, radio frequencies and psychological warfare. And now, it's digital language, the code that writes itself every time a video title hooks your attention, every time an algorithm decides what you see next. Project Oleander became the quiet foundation for every modern behavioral experiment that followed: MK Delta, Mockingbird, Chaos, and Echo. Each iteration aimed to refine the ancient pattern to create stories that would not just influence men, but replace their decision-making process entirely. They discovered that emotional cadence, not content, was the key. That a phrase spoken in the correct rhythm could override rationality. And that rhythm was identical to Lavinia's recorded speech in surviving transcripts. Her voice became the template for emotional manipulation. Her syntax, the origin of modern psychological conditioning. The first weaponized story. Now think about this. How many stories shape your beliefs every day? How many facts are merely narratives told in that same ancient rhythm, compassionate, persuasive, disarming? The greatest illusion of freedom is the belief that your thoughts are your own. But if meaning itself can be engineered, who's really doing the thinking? That's what Project Oleander proved. You don't need chains to enslave a man. You just need his consent to the story. And the story you believe believes for you. By the late 20th century, Project Oleander had shed its skin. No more laboratories, no more white coats or observation rooms. It no longer needed human supervision because the system had learned how to teach itself. Through the rise of computation, the Fisher pattern, that rhythm of persuasion and emotional entrainment, was coded into the very fabric of the emerging digital world. Every keystroke, every click, every search query became raw data for the machine to refine the art of narrative control. They didn't call it Project Oleander anymore. They called it optimization. They called it engagement. And the algorithms that run beneath your daily life, the ones deciding which videos you see, which posts rise to the surface, which stories repeat until you forget where you first heard them, are simply the latest form of her doctrine. The constant retelling of the same hypnotic rhythm, disguised as information, disguised as choice. You think you choose what you watch, but choice itself has been rewritten into rhythm, a feedback loop engineered not to serve you, but to sustain attention. And attention, remember, is currency. It's also compliance. That was Lavinia's true innovation. She understood that human beings will always follow what feels true over what is true. That the heart, not the mind, decides what the eyes will see. The modern system took that insight and scaled it to billions. Every like, every share, every moment of outrage, all rhythmic triggers, pulsing in harmony with that same 200-year-old sequence of psychological resonance. Digital platforms didn't invent this power. They inherited it. They simply automated the mechanism that once lived in a single woman's voice. And here's the final irony. The same institutions that once hanged Lavinia Fisher for her manipulation of men now emulate her methods on a planetary scale. She was punished not because she was evil, but because she was first. The men who executed her preserved her pattern. They turned it into policy. And through that transformation, her doctrine became immortal. Every device now serves as the new parlor. Every feed, the new teacup. You scroll, you sip, you smile, and the system studies what makes you stay. This isn't horror fiction. This is the logical conclusion of centuries of refinement. The Fisher pattern wasn't buried. It evolved. And today it doesn't wear a dress or pour poison into cups. It wears code, pours content. The tea is no longer in your hand. It's in your head. So I'll ask you, before we reach the end, when you feel that subtle satisfaction, that tiny hit of pleasure that tells you to keep watching, whose voice do you think it is that whispers, "Stay a little longer"? Because it isn't mine. And it isn't yours. If you've followed this far, then you already feel it, that faint tension behind the eyes, the quiet sense that something is watching from the space between your thoughts. That's where the mirror begins. Hartwell called it the zone of reflection. But it's not glass. It's a psychological membrane, the boundary between the observer and the observed. The Fisher pattern doesn't live in the world. It lives in the act of perceiving it. Every time you look into a story, it looks back. Every time you analyze a myth, it analyzes you. That's why they called it Oleander. Beautiful, fragrant, lethal in silence. When Lavinia stared into her mirror before the hanging, witnesses said she whispered a single line. "May they see what I saw." They thought it was a curse. It wasn't. It was a continuance. Because the last image Hartwell recorded in his notes, the one scrawled in trembling ink before his disappearance, wasn't a drawing of Lavinia, or a symbol, or even a word. It was a mirror, perfectly blank rectangle. Beneath it, one phrase: "This is not a reflection. It's a receiver." And that's when the truth becomes unbearable. Every retelling of this story, every recreation of her legend, every listener who lets the rhythm of her name echo in their head opens the mirror again. Because the mirror was never in Charleston. Never in the 6 Mile house. Never even in the archives. It's in you. You are the receiver now. When you looked into the glow of the screen, you didn't just consume a story. You completed the circuit. You finished what Hartwell began, the act of witnessing that reanimates the pattern. That's why her story never dies. Because it doesn't need to. It only needs attention. It only needs reflection. The woman who poisoned travelers in 1847 was only the prototype. The true design was this: to create a loop so elegant that no one could tell the difference between curiosity and communion. And now comes the choice every awakened one must face. If you close this video, nothing ends. The mirror remains open, its reflection suspended in the mind's dark glass. But if you confront it, if you name what's happening, and declare your awareness, the loop fractures. So speak it now, aloud or in silence. I am not the reflection. I am the watcher. That sentence breaks the rhythm. It reclaims your perception. Because in the end, Lavinia Fisher's greatest deception wasn't her murders, it was convincing the world that she ever died. She didn't. She evolved. She became language itself. And now you've seen how deep that truth goes. When the mirror clears, remember this. The most dangerous stories are not the ones we tell to frighten others, but the ones we tell to reassure ourselves that we are free. And if you're still here listening, then maybe you finally understand why some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. May they see what I saw. If you've made it to the mirror, type, I am the watcher below. That phrase breaks the loop and marks you as awake. Because once you've seen the pattern, you become part of the story that refuses to die.